The island of Iwo Jima is often remembered as one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the Second World War. For the Marines who fought there, the volcanic rock became a nightmare that tested endurance, courage, and survival. Yet within this hellish landscape, there was one group of men who faced a fate almost guaranteed: the flamethrower operators. On Iwo Jima, an estimated 94% of the men who carried flamethrowers did not survive. Their story is not only a tale of bravery but also of horrifying odds, unforgiving tactics, and the extreme danger of carrying one of the deadliest weapons of the war. To understand why the flamethrower operators had such a high mortality rate, it is important to first know the purpose of the weapon itself. In combat across the Pacific, Japanese forces built extensive tunnel systems, bunkers, and caves designed to resist traditional bombardment. Artillery shells, mortars, and grenades often failed to neutralize the defenders hidden deep inside. The flamethrower became the terrifying solution. With its ability to project a stream of burning fuel into an enclosed space, it could wipe out an entire squad hidden in a bunker within seconds. But such devastating effectiveness came at a cost. To carry the flamethrower was to walk with death strapped to your back. The American M2 flamethrower was the most common weapon of this type during Iwo Jima. It consisted of 2 fuel tanks filled with a mixture of gasoline and thickened fuel, and a smaller tank filled with pressurized gas to propel it. Together, the system weighed nearly 70 pounds, not including the weight of the Marines' own gear, rifle, ammunition, and helmet. The nozzle was attached by a hose, allowing the operator to aim and spray fire up to 150 feet. The visual impact was horrifying, as the jets of fire would engulf bunkers and consume oxygen inside caves, suffocating the defenders even if the flames did not touch them directly. But while the weapon was effective, it made the man carrying it one of the most vulnerable targets on the battlefield. Every Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima knew the devastation a flamethrower could cause. To them, the flamethrower operator was not just another Marine, he was the single most dangerous man on the battlefield. The Japanese viewed flamethrowers as instruments of terror, capable of wiping out carefully built defenses that had taken weeks or months to construct. As a result, they made it a priority to eliminate flamethrower operators before they could get close enough to use their weapons. Snipers lying in wait, machine gunners hidden in pillboxes, and even lone riflemen would immediately direct their fire at the Marine carrying the heavy tanks. The fuel strapped to his back made him a walking target, and the chances of survival became incredibly slim. Now, imagine the terrain of Iwo Jima itself. The island was covered in volcanic ash that made every step exhausting. Soldiers sank into the loose sand, like ground unable to move quickly or find firm footing. For a flamethrower operator carrying nearly 70 pounds of fuel and equipment, the effort was staggering. Unlike riflemen who could hit the ground and crawl, flamethrower operators were forced to remain more exposed due to the bulk on their backs. Their job required them to get dangerously close to the enemy, often within 20 to 30 yards of a bunker, to ensure the flames reached inside. This meant crossing open terrain under fire, with no cover, carrying tanks that could be ignited with a single well-placed bullet. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima had also prepared for this. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, who commanded the garrison, had turned the island into a fortress. More than 11 miles of tunnels connected bunkers, pillboxes, and hidden artillery positions. Caves were dug into the sides of ridges, with firing slits that could sweep open areas with machine gunfire. The Japanese soldiers rarely exposed themselves, choosing instead to fire from concealed positions that seemed to be invisible until they unleashed their weapons. For flamethrower operators, this was a death sentence. To even reach a target meant surviving long enough under fire to close the distance, but very few ever made it. One of the most terrifying realities for these men was what would happen if they were hit. While the tanks were not as volatile as Hollywood movies often suggest, they were still filled with highly flammable fuel. A bullet striking the tanks could rupture them, spilling gasoline over the operator. If ignited by a tracer round, an explosion, or even a spark, the result was a living inferno. Many Marines were burned alive when their tanks were hit, creating scenes so horrific that fellow soldiers remembered them for the rest of their lives. This gruesome fate became so well known that being assigned as a flamethrower operator was almost like receiving a death sentence before the battle even began. Interestingly, the high death rate was not only because of enemy fire, but also because of how flamethrower operators were used in battle. Commanders often assigned them to spearhead assaults on fortified positions. Since rifles and grenades could not reach deep inside bunkers, flamethrowers had to lead the way. They were forced to advance in front of the line, sometimes with only a small team of covering riflemen. Their mission was to walk directly into enemy fire, approach the bunker, and unleash flames inside. In the chaos of combat, even with support, the odds of surviving multiple assaults were almost non-existent. Many flamethrower operators were killed on their very first mission. Think about this: Marines on Iwo Jima fought for 36 days in conditions that were almost unimaginable. Casualties reached over 26,000 with nearly 7,000 killed. Within that horror, flamethrower operators faced almost certain death. Veterans later recalled that the men who carried flamethrowers had one of the shortest life expectancies of anyone on the island. The figure often cited is 94%, meaning that out of every 100 flamethrower operators, only about 6 survived the battle. This staggering number highlights both the bravery of those men and the immense danger of their role. Another important detail is that flamethrower fuel was limited. An M2 carried only enough for about 7 bursts of fire, each lasting 2 or 3 seconds. That meant the operator had less than a minute of total firing time. After that, he had to retreat, reload, or switch roles with another Marine. This limitation forced them to get extremely close to their targets and use the weapon with precision. There was no room for error, no second chance if the flames did not work the first time. And while they prepared to unleash fire, the Japanese defenders were always watching, waiting for that one exposed figure with tanks on his back. By now, you might be wondering what kept these men going. How did they gather the courage to strap on the flamethrower, knowing the odds against them? The answer lies in the Marine Corps' ethos of duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. These men knew that their weapon could save the lives of their fellow Marines by eliminating bunkers that no other weapon could reach. Many went forward willingly, understanding that their role was essential, even if it meant dying in the process. Their bravery was not in hoping to survive, but in accepting the likelihood of death and carrying out the mission anyway. It is also worth noting that flamethrowers were not just handheld. The Marines eventually brought in armored flamethrower tanks, such as the modified Sherman tanks nicknamed Zippos, which could fire flames over long distances while offering protection to the crew inside. But in the early days of the battle, before these tanks became widely available, it was the individual Marine with the M2 who had to take on the task. The human flamethrower was the first line of assault, and their sacrifices paved the way for later success. When we reflect on Iwo Jima, we often think of the iconic photograph of the flag being raised on Mount Suribachi. That image represents victory, courage, and the triumph of the American spirit. But behind that moment were thousands of men who gave their lives, including the nearly wiped out ranks of flamethrower operators. Their deaths remind us that victory came at an unbearable cost, paid by individuals who carried perhaps the deadliest and most terrifying weapon of the war. The flamethrower operators of Iwo Jima are remembered not just for their weapon but for their sacrifice. Their survival rate was among the lowest of any combat role in World War II. Yet without them, the Marines might never have broken through the Japanese defenses. They were the spearhead of every assault, the men who walked into certain death to clear a path for their comrades. Their story is one of ultimate bravery, one that deserves to be told again and again. So the next time you see that iconic image of the flag on Mount Suribachi, remember the men who made it possible, the 94% who never came home, the flamethrower operators who carried fire into the very heart of hell. Their courage was unlike anything else, and their story remains one of the darkest, yet most honorable, chapters of the Second World War. That is why their losses were so devastating on Iwo Jima. They carried a weapon that made them a priority target, a role that meant walking straight into the enemy's fire with little chance of survival. Out of every 100, only a handful lived to tell the tale. They knew what awaited them, but they fought anyway. That is sacrifice in its rawest form, and it is a legacy that should never be forgotten.